The most disturbing thing about Tess is not what happened to her. It's that a society may have needed someone exactly like her. Most readers approach Tess of the D'Urbervilles as a tragedy. A story about misfortune. A story about injustice. A story about a young woman crushed by circumstances beyond her control. But what if that isn't the deepest question? What if the real question is this: why did an entire social order seem to function more comfortably after Tess had been judged? Because once you begin looking at the novel through that lens, something unsettling starts to emerge. Tess stops looking like a character and starts looking like a sacrifice. Now, that sounds extreme. After all, societies don't gather in town squares and openly choose victims. They don't announce that someone must suffer so everyone else can feel righteous. At least, not usually. Instead, something much more subtle happens. A community develops rules. Then it develops expectations. Then it develops stories about who is respectable, who is acceptable, and who belongs. And eventually, when reality becomes messy, someone has to carry the burden of restoring those stories. Someone has to become the example. Someone has to become the warning. And that is where Tess becomes far more than a literary figure. She becomes a symbol. A memory fragment frozen inside the novel, one young woman standing before an invisible courtroom, surrounded not by judges, but by expectations. Because here is the contradiction at the heart of the story. If morality exists to protect the vulnerable, why do societies so often punish the vulnerable first? Why is it that the people with the least power frequently carry the heaviest consequences? And why does this pattern repeat across centuries, cultures, and institutions? The deeper you go, the harder these questions become to ignore. What makes Tess fascinating is not simply her suffering. It is her role. She occupies a position that appears again and again throughout human history. The person who absorbs collective anxiety. The person who carries blame larger than themselves. The person whose downfall reassures everyone else that the system still works. And that raises another uncomfortable possibility. Maybe innocence is not always protection. Maybe, under certain conditions, innocence can make someone more vulnerable. Because a system searching for stability rarely asks one question: who deserves this? Instead, it often asks a different question: who can carry this? There is a difference between those two questions. And entire civilizations have been built inside that difference. This is where the novel begins to expand beyond Victorian England. Beyond literature. Beyond one character. Suddenly we are no longer examining Tess. We are examining a mechanism. A mechanism that appears whenever communities feel threatened, whenever reputations become more important than truth, whenever preserving the image of justice becomes easier than pursuing justice itself. And once you recognize that pattern, another mystery emerges. Perhaps the central tragedy was never that Tess stood accused. Perhaps the real tragedy is that the people around her could continue believing they were innocent. Because if a society requires someone to bear its guilt, then the most important question is no longer what happened to Tess. The question is why everyone else needed it to happen. If that mechanism is real, then another question immediately appears. Why do people participate in it? Why do ordinary individuals, many of whom consider themselves decent, compassionate, and fair, become part of a system that places impossible burdens on someone else? The easy answer would be cruelty. But cruelty is rarely enough to explain history. And it is certainly not enough to explain the world surrounding Tess. Because the people who sustain these systems do not usually see themselves as villains. That is the first insight we have to confront. The greatest social judgments are often carried out by people who believe they are defending virtue. Think about that for a moment. The danger is not a society that openly celebrates injustice. The danger is a society that becomes convinced its judgments are moral. Once that happens, questioning the judgment begins to feel like questioning morality itself. And that is where the conflict inside this story becomes far more complicated than individual wrongdoing. The real struggle is not between good people and bad people. It is between truth and certainty. Those two things are not the same. Truth requires investigation. Certainty requires only agreement. And agreement is much easier. A community can survive uncertainty. What it struggles to survive is doubt about its own moral identity. This is why reputation becomes so powerful. Not because reputation reveals who people are, but because reputation allows society to believe it already knows. A name becomes a verdict. A rumor becomes evidence. An assumption becomes reality. And before long, an entire social order is operating on symbols rather than facts. That brings us to another memory fragment. Imagine a stain that cannot be washed away. Not because it is real, but because everyone agrees they can see it. The stain becomes more powerful than the person carrying it. And once that happens, something strange occurs. The individual begins to disappear. The symbol remains. This is precisely what makes Tess such an enduring figure. She represents a contradiction that extends far beyond literature. The more a person becomes a symbol, the less society feels obligated to understand them. Symbols are simpler than human beings. They fit neatly into stories. They help communities explain themselves. And most importantly, they help communities avoid asking uncomfortable questions. But here is the revelation. The system is not only judging the accused. It is protecting the judges. Every accusation creates two identities at once. The guilty and the innocent. The moment one person is placed outside the circle, everyone remaining inside feels more secure, more righteous, more certain. That is the hidden reward. And once we recognize that reward, the scale of the story suddenly expands. We are no longer looking at one community in one historical period. We are looking at a recurring human instinct. An instinct that appears whenever fear seeks simplicity. Whenever complexity becomes exhausting. Whenever people would rather identify a culprit than confront a deeper problem. Because confronting deeper problems demands responsibility. Finding a culprit offers relief. And relief is often more attractive than truth. Which leads us toward an even darker mystery. If public judgment gives people a sense of innocence, then what happens when the accused is not actually the source of the problem? What happens when the person carrying society's blame is merely hiding something much larger that nobody wants to examine? And if that is true, then perhaps the most important question is no longer why Tess was judged. The question is what everyone else was trying so desperately not to see. Before we can answer that question, we need to confront a possibility that is even more uncomfortable. What if the problem was never a failure of morality? What if morality was performing exactly the function the system needed it to perform? That sounds cynical. It sounds unfair. But this is where the deepest contradiction inside the story begins to emerge. Most people assume moral standards exist to measure behavior. Yet throughout history, moral standards have often done something else. They have measured belonging. And those are not the same thing. A society can forgive behavior. What it struggles to forgive is anything that threatens the narrative holding the community together. That distinction changes everything. Because once morality becomes connected to identity, disagreement no longer feels like disagreement. It feels like danger. And danger creates a powerful instinct. The instinct to protect the structure before protecting the individual. This is the point where the conflict surrounding Tess expands beyond justice and enters the realm of social survival. Tess represents something larger than a person. She represents an anomaly. A contradiction that refuses to fit neatly into the categories society prefers. And systems rarely know what to do with contradictions. They prefer clarity. Clear heroes. Clear villains. Clear causes. Clear punishments. But reality is rarely clear. Reality is complicated. Reality creates uncomfortable questions. And uncomfortable questions are expensive. They require self-examination. They require humility. Sometimes they require entire communities to admit they may have been wrong. That is why Scapegoats are so useful. Not because they solve problems, because they simplify them. A scapegoat converts complexity into certainty. 1,000 difficult questions become one convenient answer. A fractured system becomes one flawed individual. A collective responsibility becomes a personal burden. And suddenly everyone can move forward without confronting the deeper issue. This creates another memory fragment. Imagine a crack running through the foundation of a building. Repairing the foundation would require enormous effort. Time. Resources. Honesty. Instead, someone hangs a picture over the crack. The building remains unstable. But the problem becomes easier to ignore. That is the hidden function of many social judgments. They do not remove the crack. They conceal it. And that leads us directly to one of the most important figures in the novel's moral architecture. Not a villain. Not a monster. Something far more revealing. A person who sincerely believes in virtue while simultaneously becoming an instrument of the very system causing harm. This is why the figure of Angel Clare matters so much to the deeper meaning of the story. His role is not primarily romantic. His role is symbolic. He embodies a contradiction that exists in every era. The contradiction between ideals and reality. Between what people claim to believe and what they actually demand when their beliefs are tested. That contradiction is far more dangerous than open cruelty. Open cruelty is easy to identify. Hypocrisy disguised as virtue is much harder to see. And once that hypocrisy becomes normalized, the consequences extend far beyond any single individual. Now the scale shifts again. From one relationship to an entire culture. From one culture to a recurring pattern across civilizations. Because every society eventually faces the same choice. Protect the truth and risk instability. Or protect stability and sacrifice the truth. Many communities claim they would choose truth. History suggests otherwise. Which brings us closer to the central mystery. Perhaps the people surrounding Tess were not protecting morality at all. Perhaps they were protecting something much more fragile. Their belief that the world was fair. Because if the world was not fair, if suffering could fall upon the undeserving, if innocence offered no guarantee of protection, then the entire moral framework surrounding them would begin to shake. And that raises a revelation we are not quite ready to answer yet. What if Tess was never being punished for what she represented? What if she was being punished for what her existence revealed about everyone else? What exactly did her existence reveal? That question takes us to the threshold of the story's deepest revelation. Up to this point, it is tempting to believe that Tess represents a victim of an unfair social order. That is true, but it is not the final layer. The deeper layer is far more unsettling. Tess exposes a flaw that every stable society struggles to confront. She reveals that human beings want justice, but they also want certainty. And when those two desires come into conflict, certainty often wins. That is the revelation hiding beneath the surface. The true power of Tess as a literary figure is not that she suffers. It is that her presence forces everyone around her to choose between reality and the story they tell themselves about reality. Most people imagine that societies are held together by laws, institutions, or traditions. Those things matter. But beneath all of them lies something even more powerful: shared narratives. Stories about who deserves respect. Stories about who belongs. Stories about what kind of world people believe they live in. Once those stories become sacred, protecting them can become more important than confronting uncomfortable truths. This is where Tess transforms from a character into a mirror. Her role is not simply to endure judgment. Her role is to reveal the hidden cost of collective self-deception. Consider another memory fragment. Imagine a beautiful house standing in the sunlight. The walls appear solid. The windows shine. Everything looks secure. But beneath the structure, unseen by everyone walking past, the foundation has begun to shift. The danger is not the crack itself. The danger is the refusal to look down. Tess functions as that crack. She is evidence that the system is not as fair as it claims to be. She is evidence that innocence does not guarantee protection. She is evidence that social approval and moral truth are not always aligned. And that creates a profound contradiction. Because if society acknowledges what Tess represents, then society must also acknowledge its own limitations. It must admit that suffering is not always deserved. It must admit that virtue is not always rewarded. It must admit that people can be judged according to standards they did not create and cannot control. Those admissions are psychologically expensive. They threaten certainty. They threaten identity. They threaten the comforting belief that good outcomes naturally follow good behavior. The consequence reaches far beyond one community or one historical period. Entire civilizations have built moral systems partly to make life feel understandable. People need to believe that actions and outcomes follow a predictable pattern. Without that belief, the world becomes unstable. Yet Tess stands at the edge of that stability and quietly asks a dangerous question: what if reality is more chaotic than the stories we use to explain it? This is why her legacy remains powerful more than a century later. She is not remembered merely because she experienced injustice. She is remembered because she exposes the psychological bargain that many societies make. The bargain that says preserving confidence in the system may matter more than confronting evidence that the system is flawed. And now we arrive at a revelation that changes the scale of everything we have discussed. Perhaps the central conflict was never between an individual and a community. Perhaps it was between two competing human needs, the need to know the truth and the need to feel safe inside a meaningful story. But if that is the real conflict, then an even larger mystery begins to emerge. What if the people surrounding Tess were not defending morality, reputation, or tradition at all? What if they were defending their faith in a world that they desperately needed to believe was just? If that faith is what people were really protecting, then we can finally reach the heart of the story. The deepest question is no longer whether Tess was treated fairly. The deepest question is why her suffering became necessary within the moral imagination of the world around her. And the answer reveals the central insight that many readers never fully articulate. The story is not primarily about guilt. It is about the transfer of guilt. That is the core revelation. The system survives by relocating responsibility away from itself and placing it somewhere visible, personal, and emotionally manageable. Tess becomes important because she performs a function that extends far beyond her individual existence. Her role is not merely that of a victim. Her role is that of a container. A vessel into which anxiety, contradiction, uncertainty, and moral discomfort can be poured. Once that transfer occurs, something remarkable happens. The larger system no longer has to examine itself. The focus narrows. The questions shrink. Structural failures become personal failures. Collective responsibility becomes individual responsibility. Complexity becomes simplicity. This is why Tess remains such a powerful literary symbol. She reveals a mechanism that appears again and again throughout human history. Not because societies enjoy injustice. In many cases, quite the opposite. People often convince themselves they are pursuing justice while unknowingly protecting the conditions that make injustice possible. That is the paradox. The most enduring systems rarely maintain themselves through force alone. They maintain themselves through stories. Stories that explain why suffering exists. Stories that explain why certain outcomes feel deserved. Stories that transform uncertainty into meaning. And when those stories are threatened, communities instinctively search for ways to restore them. Consider another memory fragment. Imagine a scale that appears perfectly balanced from a distance. Everyone admires its symmetry. Everyone trusts its fairness. But hidden beneath one side is an unseen weight. The scale was never balanced at all. Yet as long as nobody looks underneath, confidence survives. Tess functions as that hidden weight. Her existence exposes the gap between what society claims to value and what it actually rewards. More importantly, she exposes something about human nature itself. People do not simply want truth. They want a truth they can live with. A truth that preserves identity. A truth that protects belonging. A truth that allows them to continue believing they are part of a moral world. This is why the novel reaches beyond Victorian culture and touches something universal. The central conflict is not between one woman and one society. It is between reality and narrative. Between what is and what people need to believe. That scale shift changes everything. Suddenly we are not discussing a historical community. We are discussing a recurring pattern in organizations, institutions, political movements, online communities, and even personal relationships. Whenever preserving a narrative becomes more important than confronting reality, someone eventually carries the cost. And that realization transforms the meaning of Tess's legacy. Her importance does not come from the fact that she suffered. Countless literary characters suffer. Her importance comes from what her suffering reveals. She reveals that innocence alone cannot protect a person when a system needs certainty more than truth. She reveals that moral language can sometimes conceal moral blindness. Most of all, she reveals that communities often recognize their deepest contradictions only after they have projected them onto someone else. And that leaves us with a consequence far larger than the novel itself. If human beings have a tendency to protect meaning by transferring responsibility, then how many of our institutions, traditions, and judgments still operate according to the same hidden logic today? And if that pattern continues across generations, what kind of legacy does it leave behind for the people who inherit it? Once we see that pattern, the most important question is no longer how the system protected itself. The question becomes, what was the cost? Because every mechanism of social preservation leaves something behind. Every attempt to protect certainty creates consequences that continue long after the original conflict has faded from memory. And that is where the legacy of Tess becomes truly profound. The first consequence is not social. It is psychological. When a community repeatedly transfers responsibility onto individuals, people begin to internalize a dangerous belief. They learn that fairness and worthiness are not necessarily connected. They learn that being right does not guarantee protection. They learn that acceptance can depend on forces beyond character, effort, or integrity. That lesson changes how human beings see themselves. It changes how they trust institutions. It changes how they relate to one another. The effect is subtle, but it accumulates across generations. A society that repeatedly mistakes appearance for truth eventually teaches its members to fear judgment more than injustice. That is a powerful legacy. But the consequences do not stop there. They expand outward into culture itself. Over time, communities develop habits of perception. Certain narratives become familiar. Certain assumptions become automatic. Certain people become easier to blame than others. The original circumstances may disappear, yet the underlying pattern survives. This is why the novel still feels modern. Not because the world remained the same. The world changed dramatically. Technologies changed. Institutions changed. Public discourse changed. Yet the psychological architecture remains recognizable. The tendency to simplify complex problems. The desire to assign responsibility quickly. The comfort that comes from believing difficult realities can be reduced to individual failures. These instincts continue to shape public life in countless ways. Consider one final memory fragment. An empty courtroom after everyone has gone home. The verdict has already been delivered. The voices have faded. The judgment is complete. Yet one question remains sitting silently in the room. What if the wrong problem was solved? That image captures the enduring power of the story. Because the deepest consequences often emerge after the judgment ends. The visible conflict disappears. The hidden assumptions remain. And those assumptions continue influencing future decisions, future relationships, and future systems. This is where the scale shifts again. The legacy of Tess is not limited to literature. It becomes a lens through which we can examine the human condition itself. Her role evolves from character to symbol, from symbol to warning, and from warning to diagnostic tool. She helps us recognize moments when a community becomes more concerned with preserving coherence than pursuing understanding. More concerned with defending narratives than confronting reality. More concerned with locating fault than examining causes. That legacy explains why her significance has endured for generations. Not because she provides answers. Because she exposes vulnerabilities that continue to exist. Vulnerabilities in institutions. Vulnerabilities in moral systems. Vulnerabilities within human psychology itself. And perhaps the most unsettling consequence is this. The mechanism revealed by the story does not require malicious people to function. It requires ordinary people seeking certainty, belonging, and meaning. That realization makes the problem far more difficult to dismiss. Because it places the question closer to us than we might like. Not in distant history. Not in another society. Not in fictional characters. In ourselves. Which leaves us with a final unresolved paradox before we reach the end of this journey. If human beings naturally seek stability through shared narratives, and if those narratives sometimes depend upon simplifying reality, then is it actually possible for any society to achieve justice without first confronting its own need for certainty? Perhaps that is why this story continues to endure long after its historical moment has passed. Not because it belongs to a particular century, a particular culture, or a particular set of social rules. It endures because it reveals something that remains unfinished within the human condition. Throughout this journey, one figure has stood quietly at the center of everything. Not as a hero. Not as a villain. Not even as a victim alone. But as a mirror. A mirror reflecting the distance between the world people hope exists and the world they actually create. And that may be the final insight hidden beneath the surface of the novel. The lasting significance of Tess is not found in what happened to her. It is found in what she reveals about everyone else. She reveals how fragile moral certainty can be. She reveals how easily compassion can be overshadowed by the desire for order. She reveals how often human beings mistake social agreement for moral truth. Yet her deepest legacy may be something even more profound. She reminds us that every society tells stories about itself. Stories about fairness. Stories about responsibility. Stories about who deserves understanding and who deserves judgment. Those stories help communities function. They create belonging. They create meaning. They create stability. But they also create blind spots. And sometimes the people who expose those blind spots become the hardest people to see clearly. Consider the images that remain after everything else fades away. A lone figure standing before an invisible courtroom. A stain that exists because others insist on seeing it. A crack hidden beneath a beautiful foundation. An empty courtroom after the verdict has been delivered, with a single unanswered question still hanging in the air. These are more than literary symbols. They are reminders of something enduring about human nature. The most important truths are often not the ones that comfort us. They are the ones that unsettle us. The ones that force us to examine assumptions we would rather leave untouched. The ones that ask us whether our judgments reveal more about the people being judged or about ourselves. This is where the story ultimately transcends literature. It becomes a meditation on perception itself. On the gap between what we know and what we believe. On the tension between understanding and certainty. On the quiet temptation to protect our worldview rather than challenge it. And perhaps that is why the novel still speaks to modern readers. Not because the world has failed to change. The world has changed enormously. But because the fundamental questions remain. Human beings still seek belonging. Communities still seek coherence. Institutions still seek stability. And whenever those desires collide with uncomfortable realities, the same moral tests continue to appear in new forms. In the end, the story leaves us not with an answer, but with a responsibility. The responsibility to look more carefully. To question the narratives that feel too convenient. To notice the difference between explanation and understanding. To recognize that the search for truth often begins where certainty ends. Because the most unsettling possibility is not that one person was misunderstood. The most unsettling possibility is that every generation creates its own invisible courtroom, its own hidden standards, its own stories about who belongs and who does not. And if that is true, then perhaps the question that remains is not whether justice existed within this story. Perhaps the question is whether any of us can recognize the moment when our need for certainty becomes greater than our willingness to see another human being as they truly are.